Hello everyone, my name is Julia Zanto, and for my honors thesis, I conducted a research study titled The Effects of a Psychoeducational Intervention on Perceptions of EMDR Treatment. For a little bit of background into this study, first, what is EMDR? Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, was developed in 1987 by Francine Shapiro as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This treatment facilitates the processing of traumatic memories through therapist hand movements, which stimulate client eye movements comparable to those found in the rapid eye movement cycle of sleep. The REM cycle is already linked to memory processing, and this is what gives the theoretical basis for EMDR. Trained therapists are able to go through 8 phases with their clients, including gleaning of client history, preparation of the client for treatment, assessment of the traumatic memory, treating that memory, and finally evaluating the results of the treatment. EMDR has been most successful in the treatment of PTSD. However, it's a relatively new treatment, and more research has started to come out, and this research has demonstrated that EMDR could also be successful in the treatment of other disorders. The EMDR Institute cites multiple studies which have examined the effects of this treatment on body dysphoria, phobias, depression, and generalized anxiety, among other disorders. And all of these have demonstrated initial success in using EMDR as a treatment. The critical thing to recognize about EMDR is that it is successful because it assists individuals in processing traumatic memories. This is why it works so well in the treatment of PTSD, because this disorder stems from specific traumatic memories. Conversely, this treatment is less likely to be effective for a disorder that does not arise from a traumatic experience. Next, and really important in this study, is to discuss perceptions. Perceptions for this study are built, and it's the combination of knowledge and attitudes. Knowledge is defined in this study as understanding the facts or the how-to of something, in this case, EMDR. For example, a knowledge question in this study might seek to understand if an individual knew that there was a wide body of research about EMDR. Attitudes, on the other hand, relate to what someone believes about a treatment. It's the subjective opinions that they have. In this study, an attitude question might seek to understand if a participant truly believed that EMDR is successful as a treatment. This belief arises apart from the facts, even though they might be influenced by them. There have been many studies which have explored the perceptions of both the general public and health professionals in various types of treatments. One example of this is the influential study titled Mental Health Literacy, a survey of the public's ability to recognize mental disorders and their beliefs about the effectiveness of treatment. This was by Jorm et al. And published in 1997. This study not only examined the perceptions of the public, but also came to the critical conclusion that in order for sufficient action to be taken in the treatment of mental health disorders, the public needed to be properly educated and aware of treatment options. This brings us to psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is information about evidence surrounding a treatment or disorder. This could be in the form of a lecture, a pamphlet, or really any other means of delivery. It can be used for both patients and those in their support system to properly inform them about what is going on, either this disorder that they are experiencing or a treatment that might help them. Many articles have explored the effects of psychoeducational interventions on perceptions of various therapies. One such article, entitled Electroconvulsive Therapy, The Impact of a Brief Educational Intervention on Public Knowledge and Attitudes, by Hoffman, McClellan, Hugendorn, and Beck, published in 2017, discovered a significant increase in the perceptions of the public regarding ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, as a result of reading a brief informational article. So, where does this bring us? Well, there are many articles that have supported the efficacy of EMDR as a treatment. EMDR is useful, it works. There are also many articles which look at perceptions of the public regarding various types of different treatments for mental health disorders. But there weren't any of these about the public's view regarding EMDR. As such, with this study, I sought to fill this gap in the literature by researching the perceptions of the general public surrounding EMDR, while experimentally exploring if a psychoeducational intervention also demonstrated a significant impact on these perceptions, as previous research would have indicated. The purpose of this study was first and foremost, as I said, to add to the existing body of research exploring psychoeducational interventions and public perceptions of treatments, specifically EMDR in this case. And also, because this is a new study and there hadn't been anything like this completed before for EMDR, a second purpose of this study was to create a scale that accurately measured the perceptions of the public regarding the treatment of EMDR. And because this was an experimental study, there was a hypothesis. And this hypothesis is based on the previous research of psychoeducation, and the hypothesis stated that there would be a significant increase in perceptions of EMDR after a brief psychoeducational intervention. So now we get to really get into the meat of this study and see how it was conducted. First, this study used a between subjects research design. This study also used an online survey. In this case, we used a Google Forms survey, and as you can see here in this picture, this is what the first page of this study looked like for participants who are opening it. The first page was a welcome page or an informed consent. There were no questions on this, simply it informed participants of a bit about what they would be doing, that this research was approved by the Institutional Review Board at the University of Sioux Falls, and it also informed them that they could leave any questions or blank, they could drop out at any point of the survey without any sort of consequence. And that's a really important part of this first page. It's just an introduction. The next section that students would have seen, that participants would have seen, was the demographics questionnaire. This included simple background information such as age, gender, race, as well as some more specific questions that we could use in analysis of our population. These types of questions really talked about the understanding if there was prior knowledge regarding EMDR, if there was a history of psychotherapy either in the family or if anyone had ever experienced EMDR. Those questions really enabled us to get a grasp of what this population was comprised of. The next part of this study, which was still a demographic section, was the PHQ-9. The PHQ-9 is a clinical scale of the level of depression. It's used as an early assessment for an individual who might be experiencing depression by asking questions about common symptoms. It ranks a total score of the 9 questions on this survey on a scale of minimal, mild, moderate, moderate to severe, and severe levels of depression. In this study, we use this as a demographic tool in order to assess the mental health of our population. Next, participants were exposed to the pretest. This pretest was the scale that was created in order to measure perceptions regarding EMDR. This questionnaire that was created was 25 statements and used a 5-point Likert scale to measure responses. Of the 25 statements, 6 were categorized as knowledge questions and 19 were categorized as attitudes. All of these questions were a mix of either positive or negative responses, and they were phrased differently, and as such, once the tests came back, some of the statements were reverse scored. What this allowed was a higher score on the survey demonstrated a more positive view of EMDR. Next was the intervention. There were actually 2 links to the survey that was distributed to students. One was the control and one was the experimental. The experimental survey had a brief article adapted from information from the EMDR Institute about how this treatment works, current research on it, expected outcomes for those that utilized it. It was very brief, a few paragraphs, and just gave some background information. Meanwhile, the other link was a control intervention, an article in similar length, except it was about mental health. And this was adapted from information published by the Center for Disease Control. Finally, participants once again reviewed the scale that was in the pretest, that 25-question survey, and they filled that out again. Here on this screen are some pictures of what the survey looked like. First, this is what the demographics survey would have looked like for participants as they went through. As you can see, these are just a few of the questions, but a participant would see, what is your age? They were able to type in their answer. They were able to select what gender they were. The next page was the PHQ-9. Here you get a little bit of an idea of what that looks like. There are 9 statements, again, that have to do with symptoms of depression, and those options for answers all correlate to a number, which would give the participant, would rank them as on the level of depression that they would have. It's just correlated to the score that they have. Finally, here's a picture of the pretest, post-test perception scale to give you an idea of what that looks like. As you can see, there are instructions at the top of the page instructing participants that 1 meant they strongly disagreed with a statement and 5 meant that they strongly agreed. And the statement is just right there, and they would mark on the scale where they felt they ranked in the level of agree to disagree. All right, now we get to start looking at the results. First, for demographics, there were 167 surveys that were returned. 162 of these were included for analysis. 5 needed to be excluded due to insufficient completion. Of these 162 responses that were used, 89 were from the experimental group, and 73 were from the control. Again, the experimental group read that psychoeducational intervention, whereas the control group read an article just about general mental health. The age range for the participants was 18 to 53, with a median age of 20.91 and a standard deviation of 3.87. 68% of participants reported they were female, 18.1% reported they were male, and 13.8% either selected other or chose to not report what their gender was. This spread of a lot of females is not really surprising, considering that this survey was conducted at our university and that about matches the demographics expected for the University of Sioux Falls. Next, we get to look at the PHQ-9 scores. As a reminder, this scale demonstrated the approximate level of depression that the participant demonstrated. As you can see, 54.1% scored in that minimal category and 30.4% scored in the mild category. So about 85% of participants of this study were relatively low in the depression levels. However, there is that remaining approximately 15%, which scored on the moderate to severe. So we have an interesting range of mental health to be able to really explore in this data. Next, we're going to look at the group means. There's a lot of information on this slide, but it's really important that the numbers can be viewed together. On the left-hand side, you'll see the experimental group. Again, this is the one that received the psychoeducational EMDR intervention in between the pretest and the post-test. And on the right-hand side is the control group, which received the mental health article as the intervention between the pretest and the post-test. The pretest and post-test was that one perception scale. However, as was discussed before, that can be broken down into knowledge and attitudes. Knowledge was six sections, and attitude was 19 sections. So in the pretest, the attitude score had a mean of 59.90 with a standard deviation of 6.58 for the experimental group, and the control group demonstrated a mean of 57.41 with a standard deviation of 6.85. These numbers are very similar. Likewise, the knowledge scale for the experimental group was a mean of 20.74 with a standard deviation of 2.89. For the control group, the mean was 20.19 with a standard deviation of 3.01. Finally, this full scale number just demonstrates when all of the information was taken together, the entire scale was scored out. For the experimental group, the mean was 80.64 with a standard deviation of 8.90. And for the control group, the mean was 77.60 with a standard deviation of 8.55. Now, what these numbers demonstrate is just that these groups, the two groups, were extremely similar when they started out. They were basically the same. And what gets really interesting is when we look at the numbers in the post-test after the intervention. For the experimental group, the attitude scale had a mean of 70.53 with a standard deviation of 8.60, whereas the control group had a mean of 59.14 with a standard deviation of 7.93. The knowledge scale had a mean of 19.40 with a standard deviation of 2.50 for the experimental group, whereas the control group had a mean of 17.67 and a standard deviation of 2.78. And finally, again, for that full scale, the mean was 93.20 with a standard deviation of 10.98 for the experimental group, and 78.75 for the mean, and a standard deviation of 10.32 for the control group. So what's really exciting is that these initial numbers seem to demonstrate that there's a difference in the post-test between these two groups. So next we get to the critical tests and analysis of this data that we got. There were 3 tests that were really crucial for success and analysis in this study. The first of which is a test for the scale itself. The Cronbach's Alpha is a test of internal reliability. Does this scale actually measure what it's supposed to? Is this actually an EMDR perception scale? For a Cronbach's Alpha, an alpha score of 0.8 is considered ideal. The second 2 tests both really are used for statistical analysis of the data that was received from the scale. The second test that's really critical here is a Pearson's correlation. Pearson's correlation is a test which determines if there's a relationship between two factors. And in this case, it's going to be a relationship between a participant's score on knowledge and their score on attitudes. For this, a Pearson's correlation, typically an ideal would be an R score of 0.6. And finally, another critical test are t-tests, and specifically Levene's equality of variances test. These tests look at the differences between mean scores of groups, and Levene's test indicates if it's actually a statistically significant difference. So let's look at the numbers on these tests now. First, the Cronbach's alpha, which was run on the scale. Remember that an alpha score of 0.8 is ideal. For the attitude scale, it scored a Cronbach's alpha of 0.793. Initially, when all 19 were incorporated, the attitude alpha was 0.74, but this test indicated that if we excluded just one of the attitude questions from the scale, the alpha score would increase to 0.793, which is so close to that ideal. As such, all future tests and analysis of the data excluded question 24, which was an ambiguous question on the scale. The knowledge scale, which was 6 factors, scored an alpha score of 0.563. This is a lot lower and a little bit further from the ideal. However, this is common when there are just a few factors on a scale. And so this alpha score was something that we were not worried about and did not feel it was necessary to change. Finally, running a Cronbach's alpha for the entire scale, basically looking at does this survey really look at perceptions? The alpha score was 0.87, which was very exciting because it demonstrated that this survey, this scale, successfully studies and looks at perceptions of EMDR in the public. And that's an exciting accomplishment. Next, we look at the data and results of the study and results that came back from the scale. First was that Pearson's correlation. As a reminder, that was a test which determined if there was a relationship between knowledge and attitudes. And typically, an R score of 0.6 is ideal. So looking at these numbers, that's very exciting. For the pre-test, the R score was equal to 0.612. This was statistically significant and incredibly high. Similarly, the post-test had an R score of 0.543. What Pearson's correlation and these numbers really indicate is that there is a significant positive relationship between knowledge and attitudes. Likely, if one of these factors increases, the other will also increase. Next, t-tests. This is where we really get to look at the means that were described on that previous slide and see if there are any statistical significant differences between them. First, the post-test knowledge group. This information here is stating that there was a significant difference between the experimental and the control groups on post-test knowledge factors. They scored statistically significantly differently from one another. The first number, 1.73, is the mean difference. That is the difference between the two groups' means. Now, 95% CI indicates the confidence interval. With 95% certainty, if this test was repeated over again, the mean difference between these two groups would be 0.91 to 2.55. This is statistically significant. Next, post-test attitudes. This group had a very large difference on this scale, with the experimental group scoring much higher than the control group. The mean difference for this was 11.39, with the confidence intervals ranging from 8.80 to 13.98. Again, extremely high statistical significance. And finally, for the post-test full scale, the mean difference was 14.45, with the confidence intervals of 11.12 to 17.78. These findings are incredibly exciting because what it demonstrates is that there was a difference between the groups as a result of that psychoeducational intervention. The participants who read about EMDR scored higher on the post-test full scale, and as such knowledge and attitudes both as well, scored higher than those who did not read about EMDR. So with these exciting results, what can we conclude from this study? Well, first of all, due to the results of the Cronbach's alpha, we can conclude that the second purpose of the study was met. This study resulted in the creation of a reliable measure of public perceptions of EMDR. This is incredibly exciting because nothing like this scale was able to be found in the research prior to this. And because this scale demonstrated statistical significance, we can also say that this study resulted in the first measure of public perceptions regarding the treatment of EMDR. But this study was not intended only to be a survey. Recall the hypothesis from the study suggesting that a psychoeducational intervention would result in higher perceptions and more positive attitudes regarding EMDR when compared to participant groups that did not receive this psychoeducational intervention. The results of this study, specifically in the t-test and group mean differences, supported this hypothesis. This is also an exciting find because this means this study is in line with prior research which has looked into psychoeducational interventions for other various treatments. All of these together demonstrate the idea that when an individual knows more about something or learns just a little bit about it, when that seed of understanding is planted, they are more likely to have a positive perception of that treatment. And if you take that idea and you bring it to its conclusion, that would mean that that individual would be more likely to seek treatment because they know about the treatment. This individual might not need EMDR for themselves to work through PTSD or some other disorder. However, they might come in contact with somebody else, and they might be able to support that person because they have this understanding. And that is a really exciting conclusion because we want individuals to be able to get the help that they need in treatment of disorders. And simply a short, brief pamphlet with a little bit of information can help that process. Thank you for taking the time to listen and learn about this study which I conducted. I hope that you were able to take a little bit of information away from it and learn about the process of creating this scale and as well as looking at the results of this study. Here is a page of the references that I have used for this project. Thank you.